All right, everybody, we got another episode here on the Share Your Experience platform. You've got myself, Matthew, and another amazingly named human, Dr. Matthew Lowe. He's with Unlimited Science, and yeah, we're gonna talk about some fun experiences here today. And like we usually do, I'm gonna kick it over to Matt to just kind of give a little brief intro on himself. But really, Matt, I want to kick it over to you to kind of open the vault a little bit on maybe your first experience with plant medicines or psychedelics, something that was pivotal that we can just kind of open the vault and explore with you a little bit and connect with you a little bit deeper and start to pick apart from there.
Yeah, of course. So I have a bit of a long history with plant medicine and its impact on my life. So essentially, I grew up in Cape Town, South Africa, where I'm from. I left when I was 21, and I've had chronic depression for as long as I can remember. So I've been in and out of therapist's office my whole childhood. I was on, half a dozen different SSRIs and different medications. And nothing was really working for me. And this kind of stayed with me, this depression in and out throughout my life. But I maintained my ambition during that time and the goals that I wanted to get into. During my bachelor's degree, I just happened to take on a psychology course, as many people do when they're trying out new subjects. I went into my bachelor's thinking, I'm going to try out philosophy and English and creative writing. And I ended up in psychology. And particularly within psychology, I was really fascinated with the cognitive neuroscience courses in psychology and high level aspects of the brain. So I became really fascinated in this neuroscience behind everything that we do. And just that it was this kind of black box that we still knew so little about, and there was so much to explore. So after I left Cape Town when I was 21, I pursued a master's and PhD at the University of Toronto in cognitive neuroscience and psychology. And that's where I really became a lot more familiar with neural mechanisms associated with perception, sensory experiences, personality, and really had a diverse interest in neuroscience. But during this time, I continued to battle with depression. Actually, little known fact, but over half of academics in graduate school will at some point suffer from depression. It's a very strict, harsh, kind of regulated program. There's a lot of competition. It's often people who are perfectionists, who are used to being the best in their class. And so there's a lot of pressure that you put on yourself. And so I struggled with depression throughout this time. And nothing had really helped. And I tried a few more SSRIs. They determined that I had treatment resistant depression, and that was kind of it. And but the big change happened when I was accepted to MIT for my postdoc. So I did my postdoc at the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence lab there. And it was around the time that I was finishing my PhD in Toronto and had yet to start my postdoc at MIT in Boston that the depression hit me really hard. I had what I now recognize as what's called the arrival fallacy. It's this idea that we have these goals, these lofty goals that we set for ourselves. And, when we get there, we're going to achieve happiness. Like when I get this thing, that's when I'm going to be happy. So I had always wanted to go to MIT, and this has been my goal for years throughout graduate school. And I finally got this position accepted at MIT, and it actually left me feeling pretty empty. It wasn't associated with the happiness or joy that I was expecting it to feel. There wasn't a sense of pride or accomplishment. I just kind of felt flat. And that spiraled me into a really bad depression right before I started my postdoc. And it was just coincidentally around that time that I became more open to new things because sort of my barriers were down. I was kind of at the bottom of the barrel, so to speak. And my family had always been kind of anti-drug. I'd never really explored any drugs up until that point. I'd been very straight-laced throughout my life and very kind of introverted and focused on my academic work. But a friend introduced me to firstly MDMA and then psilocybin and LSD for the first time. And I just had these really profound experiences. I remember doing MDMA for the first time and thinking, oh, wow, this is what it's like to not have anxiety, just to be in your body in the present moment, to be there, gathered with your thoughts. And it was just this really interesting phenomenon that I experienced. And through that, tried LSD and had some really profound experiences, more intense, far more intense on LSD that got me to think about my own cognitive behaviors, the patterns and the rituals that I had in my life that I didn't even see, these things that were protecting me from taking opportunities and living my life the way that I wanted to. I got this new perspective in very intense and difficult and challenging ways, but ultimately really profound ways. Psilocybin was more of a gentler beast for me, kind of calmly guiding me into those experiences. I found a lot of catharsis and release with psilocybin from like repressed emotions. But during this time, what was really fascinating about the experience is psychedelics did what no SSRI could do for me at the time. And that was they started to shift me out of my depressive state. So they started allowing me to explore new things. I became a little bit more social, a little bit more gregarious. I said yes to new things. I kind of took on this new persona in my life. And as I went through grad school, so my postdocs. So first I worked at MIT and then Harvard, and I was working in high level systems neuroscience, looking at visual and auditory cortex, running individuals through fMRI and EEG and MEG experiments. But I became really fascinated then with the intersection of psychedelics and the sensory experience. And from there, it kind of evolved into psychedelics and the mental experience, the mental health conditions. So I kind of switched a bit, and I left Harvard, and I joined a lab at Stanford University as the director of research, and that was a mental health lab. So now I found myself in the right area that I wanted to be in, mental health, something that was more related to how I wanted to see change in the world. But I still had this issue of like, well, psychedelics, I think, are the next frontier in understanding of human consciousness and mental health. So how do I translate that? And so that was actually when I took the leap and I resigned from my job at Stanford. And I just started volunteering for this small organization called Unlimited Sciences. Unlimited Sciences does naturalistic or observational research. So they focus on research in real world settings, so done outside of clinical settings. And that was really appealing to me at the time because it was outside of the academic context. And academia had been such a difficult place to exist for such a long time and so strict and rigid and formal. And suddenly I was in this new landscape of interacting with individuals who had been doing psychedelics, who were interested in psychedelics, and my passion for it just exploded. This was about 5 years ago. And yeah, so since then, I have just been so involved in this field. I ran Unlimited Sciences for a few years. We just had a new executive director take over. I'm now the chief scientific officer. Also, I run their research for the cannabis side of things, realm of caring. I do cannabis research for them. And so essentially, I think discovering or being introduced to drugs in my late 20s completely shifted the entire trajectory of my life, not just in my mental health. I can now say that, with chronic depression, it's never fully cured. It never kind of goes away fully, but the life that I have now compared to before is unimaginably different. I feel so much better in so many different ways. I feel more in touch with myself. I feel calmer. I'm more assertive in my needs and recognizing not just what I want, but who I am authentically. I think that's what really helped me is psychedelics got me in touch with not the person that I was trying to create, the life that I wanted to create, this kind of picture of who I thought I would be, but it actually got me to accept who I actually was, what I do enjoy, what brings me happiness. And by taking those things and learning from those experiences with psychedelics, I took them into my real life. And the interesting thing now is I don't actually do a lot of psychedelics anymore, but I feel that I've learned so many major life lessons. They've been my teachers for so many years.
Wow, thanks for sharing that there. So just circling back to your first introductory experiences with MDMA and psilocybin, and then LSD. Like, what was that? What did that process feel like? Was there some kind of like, I need this moment, or was it just a, you felt like a gradual, hey, this is the next step of exploration, or sometimes it feels like there's a moment of desperation that hits for some people, like, I need something, and and then, right, then you're willing to try anything. And if your preconceived notion is, hey, there are these drugs, right, and then all of a sudden it's, I'm willing to try anything, maybe this isn't what I thought it was, you know
That's a great question, and it's more to the latter of what you said. I'd been chronically depressed for so long, and I'd tried everything, and I'd been through therapy and different methods of cognitive therapy, and nothing had really worked for me. So, and I'd always been anti-drug, and that's just how I was raised. And so when it presented itself to me in my late 20s, it was more that approach of, well, I mean, I've tried everything else, so why not just give this a shot now? So my barriers went down. I was kind of open to new things, not because I was in a good place, but more because I was in a bad place. And I was just like, had this attitude of, well, to hell with it. I'll just give it a shot and see what happens. Um, and so I became open to the idea and very receptive to the idea. My first experience was with MDMA. That was the first thing I took. And it was just at home, like a relatively low dose, just to see how it would feel. And it was just an amazing experience to be in my body for the first time in what felt like years. Because I'd lived so in my head, so cognitively, so academically, been trained in these like very formal institutions of perfectionism where we're constantly analytical and thinking and never in our bodies. And so to have that experience and be connected to my body in that way was really profoundly moving to me. And I kind of thought, well, what else can I do to get into my body? Like meditation? Can I do more breath work? Like, what else can I do to get in my body? Because I really like that feeling. Um, and then LSD was a sort of funny one to me. I did it very shortly after trying MDMA for the first time. And I was studying visual perception at the times. I would study the ventral visual cortex, so how we categorize different objects and scenes. So we're taking lines, motion, color, and we're forming categories of objects and scenes through this and understanding visual perception. So my work was on putting people on scanners and really understanding how people perceive the world. And so I had my academic hat on for the first time when I tried LSD, and I remember it shifting my visual experiences, and my fascination was like, oh wow, what's this doing to the visual cortex? Like, that's fascinating, because I was thinking of it from this like academic perspective. So my first experiences were just very kind of interesting from a sensory perspective of feeling and seeing things differently and seeing myself differently, and the perceptions that were changing were very impactful. But from there, it shifted to not just looking at the visual perceptions, what was changing around me in terms of exogenously, what I was seeing, but also what was happening inside me. It was like, I mean, Stanislav Grof, talks about this idea of non-specific amplifiers with psychedelics, where psychedelics just amplify something that's below the surface, non-specifically, that needs to come to your attention. And then that started happening, and I started noticing that these things that I didn't necessarily think were important were actually important in my life. And I started kind of working through different challenges that I had. And it was mostly around this concept of trying to be someone that I thought I should be versus authentically engaging with the life that I wanted to live, and trying to connect those two. And as soon as I let go of this life that I wanted to live, this like picture, this version of myself that I'd had in my head since I was a kid and had grown up so strict with, when I let that go and I allowed myself to be open to new experiences, then that's really when everything shifted for me for depression. I started just engaging with life in a totally different way, in a really beautiful way that I still carry to this day.
I think that is the one very, very common thread that I feel like comes up, and there's various ways of saying that, but ultimately it is letting go,
Yeah,
and
surrendering
and
to the experience.
yeah, and exactly, and on a grand level, the experience that we're in of life. Surrender to this experience, and people phrase it a few different ways, but kind of remaining unattached. And I feel like I share a similar sentiment with you there, in that we get this very tunnel vision of how something's supposed to go. At least I feel that way. Tunnel vision of how something's supposed to go.
Yeah.
What you are, how you look, how you portray what your life is supposed to be like, and then when it doesn't exactly fit, you know, then everything kind of breaks down. And to me, it is really uncanny how as soon as you let go of that tunnel vision, the whole world opens up to you, and you realize that you are living that already, and you just
Yeah.
couldn't see it because you had these weird blinders on that, I don't necessarily understand, on a neurological level. You might be able to enlighten me a little bit more of, why we end up with those blinders over time. Like what, maybe it's that concept of the default mode network, or something where we just, over time we get into this way of thinking, and something's gotta break us free. I feel that way a lot too, just in like every aspect of life, where, oh, I'm in this mode for 6 months or 12 months, whatever it is. And you're like, wow, I've been in this mode of thinking, whether it's in work, and,
Yeah.
you know, I'm really good at like working in these tight, like handcuffs, and really creative here. But like, what if the handcuffs were removed? There's this whole bigger picture and world that I haven't been able to think about, and as soon as you give yourself space to explore that, it's like, whoa, what am I doing here?
And so there's actually some really solid neuroscience behind that, that I'd love to share with you. So essentially, so serotonin, psychedelics, classic psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin are primarily acting on the 5-HT2A receptor, so the serotonin 2A receptor. And this receptor is really abundant in human biology. I mean, it affects everything: mood, cognition, even circadian rhythms, sleep, you name it, sexual function, it affects it. So, what's really interesting about this is it's also primarily involved in learning and neuroplasticity. So, serotonin density is associated with increases in neuroplasticity and learning, the ability to adapt and learn new situations. And when we're kids, so serotonin density actually begins very early. It starts at about 5 weeks of gestation in utero. And by the age of two, serotonin density really starts to increase, and it has the highest density between the ages of 2 and 5 years old. So that's this period of extreme neuroplasticity and learning. We're forming new associations, we're learning, we're hardwiring different patterns of thinking. But what's really interesting about that is it slowly declines until about the age of 14 years old in adolescence, and then it remains stable throughout the rest of our life. And if you think about this in the context of childhood development, of childhood trauma, of learning habits, social reward learning, all of this happens in those crucial formative years, before the age of 14. So these experiences that you have early on in your life, these patterns of thinking, these interactions you have, they become rigid. So the more you perform an action, a ritual, a behavior, anything, it reinforces that action. And these pathways that we have, you can think of them like ski tracks. So you're forming these ski tracks, and you aren't really able to break out of them because they're so entrenched in your mind. These rigid thought patterns. But what psychedelics do, and this is really fascinating, it was a 2023 paper that came out in Nature, and they found that psychedelics can reopen that critical period. So critical period of learning when we're younger. So it allows for the critical period to be opened, and we can essentially relearn new behaviors and form new neural networks associations. So it essentially leads our brain from this modular state into a global state of connectivity. We see more communication across different regions. We see enhanced neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, which is the formation of new neurons. And all of that allows learning to take place much more easily. So when you think about mental health disorders and why this is so critical, so for example, psilocybin. So psilocybin is a critical window that's estimated to be about 2 to 3 weeks after the psilocybin experience. So this is this period in the experience where your brain is incredibly neuroplastic, where you're open to learning new behaviors, new patterns of thinking. So really going into the psychedelic experience, those next 2 weeks, the experiences that you have during the experience and the follow-up integration are incredibly important with forming new behaviors. So if you have someone undergoing a psychedelic experience, those next 2 weeks for psilocybin and LSD, for example, are really critical in how we're going to change and integrate those patterns of behaviors into our real life. And the neuroscience of that actually supports that fully in terms of that period of high plasticity and learning. So it's really fascinating from that part of things. It's sort of this master key that unlocks a new state of learning that we're not really able to do otherwise outside of childhood. We get this kind of second chance to rewire and remap our brains in ways that we never thought were possible. That's why I think psychedelics will be so crucially important, not just for mental health conditions, but understanding human physiology, human consciousness, and they affect all parts of the mammalian sphere of biology. So we're going to see a lot of really interesting things happen with psychedelics and how they promote neurogenesis and the formation of new pathways. I'm really excited about the next few years.
What what does your current practice with these medicines look like?
So at Limited Sciences, we run naturalistic observational studies. So essentially, an observational study is observed. We use it in real time, so prospectively. So we run different time points, but essentially, it's just outside of a clinical setting. So it's in real world settings. People could be at home. They could be at a retreat space center. It's just outside of a controlled setting, and we were really interested in that because the idea about clinical research, it's incredibly expensive. It requires a lot of bureaucratic red tape to get approval because it's still a Schedule One substance federally, which makes it very difficult to get hold of, very difficult to study. There's not a lot of funding available on it. But with observational research, real world research, when you really think about it, 99.99% of the use cases of psychedelics are occurring out in the real world. They're not occurring in lab settings, they're occurring in people at home and at parties and in nature, and people are doing these experiences in groups and together, and that's where the experience is actually happening. So that's how Unlimited Sciences was formed back in 2018. We had this mission that we wanted to understand naturalist research. So great, we know what's happening in the lab, we know that we're seeing reductions in depression and anxiety, but what's happening in the real world? What if we examine people who are just taking psychedelics, different strains, different varieties, different dosages, in different contexts or set and settings? So what's happening there? So we ran a really big study with Johns Hopkins University from 2020 to 2022. And we enrolled about just over 8,000 individuals in that study. So it's still the largest prospective study to date on naturalistic psilocybin use. And essentially what we found was emulating clinical results. We saw reductions in depression for this group, reductions in state and trait anxiety. We saw changes to personality characteristics like extroversion and neuroticism. We also saw changes to traits such as shame and guilt. So we saw all of these facets changing in real world settings. And most of the people in the study, the majority were taking at home. They were taking it by themselves. And also most had taken psychedelics many times before. So we're getting some real world sample, real world evidence of actually what's happening. And the fascinating thing about it was the results that we're seeing in the real world were just as powerful as the results we're seeing in clinical settings. So people taking psychedelics at home with intention, responsibly educating themselves and doing it in an intentional setting, were getting as profound results as they were in a clinical setting. So that was really remarkable for us. We published that data a couple of years ago and have since published several other studies, also looking at subpopulations of their sample and marginalized groups like people of color and how psychedelics can impact them differently. But then we shifted our thinking into more underrepresented voices. So we thought, well, there's a large focus in any research on white populations. They tend to just be obscured across all areas of research, and so we wanted to give a voice to communities that didn't really have their voice represented in psychedelics. So the first study we ran was looking at Middle Eastern and North African immigrants and refugees. So this particular group is a very sensitive group in that they often experience a lot of trauma related to the migration and post-migration process. They can come from war-torn countries. They're adapting to a new culture, and so they're particularly vulnerable for mental health conditions like PTSD, depression, anxiety. So we first ran a study using ayahuasca. We ran a retreat-based study, and we found incredible results there. So reductions in depression and anxiety, reductions in PTSD markers. We saw increases in self-compassion, reductions in feelings of shame, and the qualitative results for that. So the narrative stories were beautiful. As these people recounting their experiences, reliving and processing their trauma for the first time. So that really got us onto this path of, wow, like, this is really interesting, like looking at these voices that aren't really represented in psychedelic science. And then the most recent project we did, and this was a really important project for myself as a queer man, growing up as a queer man. So psychedelics have a very interesting history with queer research. So in 1952, the APA, the Psychological Association, pathologized homosexuality, so classified it as a mental condition. And this was right around the time where research on LSD and psychedelics like mescaline and psilocybin were really picking up. And so what happened is, because homosexuality was pathologized and was seen as a mental health condition, a little known fact about psychedelics is by the 1960s, over 1,000 papers have been published on LSD, and over 40,000 patients had been treated for various different conditions before the Controlled Substance Act essentially ceased research on LSD. But because this coincided with the pathologization of homosexuality, it was being used in conversion therapy. So there were dozens of research studies and very influential individuals like Stanislav Grof, Timothy Leary, that were proponents of using psychedelics in conversion therapy to convert homosexual men or queer individuals to straight. And then because of the kind of cease in research, there hasn't been much research on that over the last 50 years. So we just published a study last month on looking at health outcomes in a group of queer individuals in a retreat-based setting. And the results were remarkable. We're seeing reductions in internalized homophobia. We're seeing reductions in sexual identity distress. We had trans individuals involved in the study too, and we're seeing reductions in like gender dysphoria and increases in self-esteem and body esteem. And the qualitative results reflect this. We're just hearing these beautiful tales of people taking psychedelics and accepting who they are, reductions in shame, increases in self-compassion, people accepting themselves as they are. So that's been a really important mission at Unlimited Sciences, is how do we reach the communities that really haven't been focused on yet in psychedelics, and how do we give a voice to those communities and let them know that psychedelics can also impact these very vulnerable communities. I mean, the queer community, for example, is far more likely to experience mental health conditions as opposed to the heterosexual community because of stigma, childhood trauma, a lot of factors that go into that. So if we can target these communities that face disproportionate rates of mental health conditions, and we can see if psychedelics could maybe impact those health conditions, I think we could really make profound changes in how we treat certain individuals. So that's exciting to me that we're doing that.
What do you think is the pathway to like actually bringing these medicines into a space where they're recognized and used as such, used as medicine? I mean, I feel like there's it's like a slow roll of everyone's kind of changing their terminology, they're changing their perspective a little bit. They are kind of adopting more of that mentality of, this is not drug, but it is therapeutic. There's definitely recreational aspects that kind of live on the fringes of those lines of thinking. But like, what's your take on what a future state would actually look like that involves the use of these as medicines, alongside of what we've kind of built in Western society?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think, the first answer that I have to that is decriminalization across every state. We're seeing really profound changes now with Oregon and their rollout of the Oregon Health Authority's Psilocybin Services Act. And now we're seeing that in Colorado that's just started. Next will be New Mexico. So we're on the right step in terms of regulated access to psychedelics. But decriminalization is essentially incredibly important because whether we want them to or not, people are going to be doing these drugs out in the real world, and they are going to be doing them. They're not going to stop doing them. And on the harm scale, psychedelics like psilocybin are incredibly safe. They have very low rates of adverse reactions. They're far safer, for instance, relatively speaking, even than alcohol. So decriminalization is a really important step just to reduce the stigma surrounding psychedelics, because there still is stigma. I'm in the psychedelic field, and often I'll talk about psychedelics in a way that's, I forget that some people it's still an issue, especially in older generations. So I think decriminalization would really help reduce stigma, which would in turn allow more conversations around psychedelics, would in turn affect policy changes and what we can accomplish through psychedelic legislation. Um, and the next one is, I mean, they're a bit lofty ambitions, but I think ultimately, with the rollout of the Psilocybin Services Act in Oregon, for example, eventually having these services covered by insurance companies, so getting them regulated in an insurance model, so that people who can't afford it can get access to it. And that's really a big one right now. I mean, the services are incredibly expensive. On average in Oregon, around $2,500 per session for a psilocybin experience. And that's, not covered by insurance. And many people will just never be able to afford that. So getting costs down, getting insurance providers on board to see how these um, impact mental health and would have a positive influence on broader aspects of well-being, reducing burden on healthcare costs, hospital utilization. So I think those are kind of good first steps to look forward to.
So now that you're kind of like today's state, right? What's your personal practice look like with any are you have a specific medicine that you're working with, say the last 12 months, or like what's your typical routine look like as far as practicing with the medicine, and then just kind of in that same vein of thought, how you approach it, right? How you take in intention, what your practice looks like, and then how do you these days facilitate that integration process?
Yeah, no, great questions. So I very rarely do psychedelics these days, but I do them now and again. And so, for instance, my last experience was with psilocybin, and before that, ayahuasca. And so, my approach personally is, and this can vary by individual, but I wait for a calling, and I approach it with a lot of reverence and respect. So, the way I do psychedelics is with intention, with respect, and with a call. And this is if something profound has happened in my life, if there's something that I feel stuck with or difficulty in moving through that area. I look to psychedelics for helping me to answer those questions myself, because psychedelics aren't the key to unlock those puzzles, but they allow you greater insight into yourself. So my approach now is when I'm called to do psychedelics like ayahuasca or psilocybin, um, I go in with an intention very clearly set in mind. And I go in with a lot of respect and reverence for the medicine, and the traditions and the long history of these medicines, which have been around thousands of years. I mean, we have modern practices to date now, which come up very different in how they used to experience psychedelics. So to kind of consider that history and the almost sacred nature of these plants and how they can elevate you, that's really how I kind of go in with that mindset of deep respect.
Tell me about your ayahuasca experience. Was that down south?
Yes. Yeah. It was a really interesting experience. It was one of those experiences where I went in with a specific intention and came out with an entirely different one, and that sometimes happens with psychedelics. I thought I had to solve one issue or one problem, and or maybe not solve anything at all, but just work through something. But had a just completely different experience, and it was good. It showed me an area of my life that I'd maybe been a little bit stuck and that I wasn't paying attention to, and that I was focused on other aspects that I needed to change. And this was actually the thing I needed to change. And specifically, I can be more specific about that. It was really about so I'd still carried a lot of anxiety about certain things in my life that I didn't realize I was really carrying, this like kind of little high level anxiety, just always a little bit on edge. And during the ayahuasca experience, this anxiety really was brought to the forefront and kind of like focused on, because it, you know, amplifies that experience. And so my ayahuasca experience was really beautiful and intense and strange and sad and all the emotions, and a lot of catharsis with this, of coming to terms with what was causing that anxiety, and how to move forward in a healthier way. And I will say that, a year later, that anxiety still exists there, but I have better ways of coping with it now, and I'm better attuned to my body to lower those rates of anxiety. So when I feel them coming up, I go, okay, well, listen to your body. Like, what are you doing that you need to do to calm down, to get that sense of safety and security back? And so that was kind of my experience with ayahuasca, is tuning into to my body again. Actually, a lot of my experiences, when I think about it, are getting out of my head and more listening to my body, is what psychedelics have taught me a lot.
Yeah, that was your first ayahuasca experience.
That was my second.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that's usually. I mean, I'm the same way where, if it calls, um, in the right way, then I'm always here to respond. At this point,
Exactly.
I trust the medicine on that level, and typically, I'll work with psilocybin and others in between, but ayahuasca is kind of the like grounding force, or like the recentering for me, is kind of
Yeah.
how I view it. And in that same way where it feels like you carry these things in, and you're like, oh, I'm carrying these intentions, and my verbal intention is always like practicing this art of letting go. And I think
Hmm.
about it as you're putting this intense, elongated, you know experience or session, and usually it's like the the anxiety, the thing comes up, and it's hard, and you deal with it, and it's like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, wow, glad we did that. And then the medicine, has a way of being like, oh, that's funny, we're going to do that 50 more times, like, just buckle
Yeah.
up. And you're like,
I
oh,
definitely had that experience.
but I love, because it almost, to what you were talking about with the you're going down the mountain, and you're creating these ski tracks. Like,
Yeah.
I like that, because it's like um, you're able to practice, right? That's what I see it as. It's this intense practice session of like,
Yeah.
okay, here's, I've dealt with this same anxiety, the same situation. How do I let go?
Yeah.
Oh, cool, that didn't work. Oh, cool, that did work. But then you're put in that situation again. It's like, okay, well, now what are you going to do? You
Yeah.
use what you did last time. And you're retraining yourself. And again, everything blends into one. But you're training yourself, and then you're in a situation a month later, to your point, and you have these new coping mechanisms. You're like, oh man, yeah, I know how to deal with that. Like, I know I call it the muscle memory. I have the muscle memory to let that go, and let that anxiety fall, or let that thing fall that doesn't need to be, that I'm worried about, or that's holding me back. It kind of
Yeah.
creates that intense muscle memory session. That's what I love about the you know specifically kind of the mama ayahuasca, and the medicine that she brings, is that high intensity, and just kind of putting you through the ringer a little bit, but in the most beautiful way. And it is always, you know, I agree with what you said there. It is always, to me, you carry something in where you think this is the problem, and it's
Yeah.
just, you know, in your normal state of mind, you're like, yes, this is the problem. I feel like I'm dealing with this over and over again. And then she shows you that's not the real problem. The real problem are
Yeah.
these three things down here that you're, you know, that you
Exactly.
don't think are anything, but these are the real problem. And if you know, flush those out, whatever you're dealing with doesn't exist anymore. Like that, you're not even in
And
that state.
I think that's the beauty of psychedelics, that we have this reality or this perception of who we think we are, and we hold on to that, and we're like, oh, you know, I know myself really well, I know my ins and outs. But then under psychedelics, we're like, uh, maybe I didn't know myself so well. Maybe I was repressing these emotions. Maybe I wasn't thinking about things in the right way. And psychedelics really open your mind to be able to look at places that you were just kind of stuck. And I had this beautiful experience my last ayahuasca where the feelings became very intense, as they do in certain times, and I kind of felt this panic rising, and I was fixated on my anxiety and trying to resolve that. And I thought that I was going to have a panic attack, and I left the retreat area for a minute just to stand outside, and I thought, oh gosh, I'm going to have a panic attack now. And then I just thought, well, maybe it's not a panic attack. Maybe this is just, you know, the surrendering part of the experience. So just surrendering to the chaos of the experience, just letting that anxiety take your body, be in your body, feel that anxiety, let it go. And I stood there outside and I just let it pass through me instead of trying to control it. It's that idea of surrendering, and calmed down, went back, joined the circle, and the rest of the evening was great. And it's kind of taught me to just, as you said, let go, to surrender to those feelings when everything's tightly wound and you get that intense feeling of anxiety and panic and you can't control the situation, to just sort of, hey, just let it go, be in the moment, it'll pass, as all things do. And that lesson has really carried with me through my life in general. Like if I'm facing a stressful period of my life, or something happens, or something that brings a lot of grief, you know, I just fixate on that, kind of surrender to the experience. This is all part of life. This is the ups and the downs and the everything in between, the chaos. We can't control everything. Just let it happen and do your best to live as best as you can.
I personally, and it's really interesting. You made me think, and earlier too, when you're talking about because I agree, it's, you've got this, whatever's happening in the head, and then, you know, however you want to describe it, of like it's translating to the body. You know, people say, oh, you're thinking here, but instead of thinking, you know, with your heart, or
Yeah.
like thinking, and it's this interesting level of like releasing, you know, the head thought, and it's like this deeper level of understanding, you know, this deeper language. And you know, the one thing, like I enjoy the purge, you know. And it's funny because I feel like I don't physically purge as often, and it's because it's like, to me, it's the body reacting, you know. The
Mhm.
purges, like the body's and I quickly, you know, in the medicine, like had learned what's triggering this. And it's like this body reaction to, you know, these feelings of judgment, these feelings of, you know, anxiety, judgment towards others, myself, you know, the situation,
Mhm.
the experience, what, you know, what's happening. And then as soon as you release that, let it go. So as soon as you enter that same, you know, practice mode of, you know, surrendering and releasing this, whatever it is, that purge feeling subsides. And I was like,
Yeah.
whoa, that's crazy. You know, it's like this physical reaction, this sickness to how I am, you know, to
It really
this.
makes you kind of link the mind and the body, and how, you know,
Yep.
in tune they are when you let them be.
Yep. That was really retraining for me, as far as, you know, being able to see things differently, and be like, you know, hold no judgment towards this. Like, just let this be, and look at it in a different way, you know, look at it with a different perspective than the one that you have, because obviously your body's telling you the one you have is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're
um,
sitting in a lot of anxiety, clearly something's not jiving very well.
One thing that I'm fascinated about, that you brought up as well, was studies around artificial intelligence. And
Mhm.
just to like open up that can of worms for a minute, and feel free to take it and share whatever you want. But
Yeah.
I'm curious on, what you think like the role that artificial intelligence has with humanity. Like what is the relationship that we are going to build with artificial intelligence? I mean, there's a lot of fear mongering, right? There's a lot of people that are saying we're going to hit this, whatever they want to call it, this point of singularity, or this point where, the
Yeah.
robot is going to get so smart where they won't need humans anymore, and they're just going to, kill us off. And it's this very doomsday that I honestly, I can't get behind that. I can't,
Yeah.
like I can't be like, yeah, that's why artificial intelligence is here. No, I feel like there's something else, something deeper there, but just kind of curious what role you think it plays with humanity, and, and ultimately like with, kind of your studies on neuroscience, things like Neuralink, like
Mhm.
integrating our neurological center with artificial intelligence, with putting silicon in the brain. I think that was one way that it had been presented, in something that I was watching that made me really think about it was, you know if you just replace the neuron in your brain with silicon one by one, at what point are you no longer you? At what point are you no longer conscious? And it's kind of this breakdown of like, is AI conscious? At what point is it conscious versus not? Just kind of
Yeah.
opening up that can of worms.
Well, I mean, to me, one of the most fascinating things about the interaction between artificial intelligence and psychedelics are we still don't really understand consciousness itself. So there are a lot of theories around how consciousness emerges, of whether it's an emergent state or whether it's contained in certain areas of the brain. Um, but to a large extent, we have no idea what the neural basis is for consciousness. And to sort of replicate that in an artificial intelligence system, which is also a black box, is a really interesting phenomenology if we can't even understand it ourselves. But that's where I think psychedelics might have an interesting impact on our understanding of artificial intelligence and the impact there. Um, if psychedelics are mind expanding and they're helping us to understand exactly what consciousness is, so the research coming out on psychedelics is, revealing different states of altered consciousness and what that means. And I think as we continue to understand the neuroscience of psychedelics and what regions are involved in the psychedelic process, we'll begin to get a better understanding of exactly what consciousness is, how it emerges in the human brain, and maybe how to replicate it. So I think there could be an interesting interaction there of using psychedelics to really understand the mind and the brain. And I think that could advance our understanding of artificial intelligence eventually.
Would you do Neuralink? Would you have the chip in the brain? Would
Not
you?
yet. Certainly not yet.
Not yet.
I would need to see a bit more beta testing done.
I think about that. I'm like, man, that it's wild. It's brilliant. It's just kind of, it's what you dream about, right? Of, at least for me.
Yeah.
Wow, I
Living in
wish.
the future, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, right. I wish everything would happen. Yeah, exactly, right. It's like I'm just thinking, I'm moving the pencil on the desk, with my mind. It's basically like that coming to life, and everything that is digital. Um,
I mean,
just
Moore's law states that every 18 months we see an exponential doubling of technology, and we're actually at this period now where technology is advancing at such an incredibly rapid pace that I think the next decade we're just going to see unbelievable changes in technology, artificial intelligence that are going to impact every sphere of our society. So we're at this precipice right now of exponential growth, perhaps one day even approaching the singularity, maybe not far away one day, which is really exciting and also a little bit terrifying because we don't know where it's going to go, how it's going to impact the human race.
we're just afraid of what we
Yeah,
don't know.
yeah, always. That's
You
the
know?
fear of uncertainty.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. What do you think about the? It's like the new BuzzFeed type of thing, right? Where everyone's talking about people that are using AI as trip sitters, and I'm like,
I
kind of
mean, that's
brilliant.
interesting because There was recently some research on so ChatGPT is being used a lot as therapy, and this is
Right, exactly.
actually an extraordinary tool for individuals who can't get access to mental health care and therapy, especially in the United States, where mental health care is often not covered by insurance. And they did some research on it, essentially finding that people who are using ChatGPT and as relationship counseling or individual therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, were seeing similar results than they were with hiring professional healthcare workers. Um, so that's a really fascinating interaction. So I think there is definitely a place for that, for sure.
I'm like, shoot, man. A lot of people just be there alone, anyways. I've been there too, where you're like, hey, I'm just going this thing alone, and it's what I want and what I need for the moment. But it's like yeah, why not? Why, I don't know.
Yeah, I think we're evolving and we're using the tools at our disposal. I mean, we're increasingly in a more disconnected society with social media and online presence. So people are adapting and they're using the tools that we have to form those connections, even if it's with, you know, ChatGPT.
You what, what does your family think about all of it now? You mentioned that you kind of grew up in that kind of way of thinking that was a little more straight edged.
Yeah.
What's
So
the evolving consensus now within just kind of your own family and personal circle?
it's been well received. So I mean, I grew up Christian. I went to Sunday school every year. My mom was always very anti-drug, but not in that like strict sense of like you if you do drugs you'll die. It was more just like this is a path you shouldn't take. But no, she's my mom's incredibly proud of me. I think I took a lot of different steps to get to where I am, but certainly my credentials at MIT, Harvard, and Stanford didn't hurt with the parental pride. But they think it's fascinating what I'm doing. My family hasn't my mom hasn't really like explored psychedelics or anything like that. My sister has, but I think we're just in a space right now where it's become, even in the last 5 years, become so much more mainstream that it's very common to talk about. It's not a surprising thing anymore. If you go out in public and you say, I did a shroom trip this weekend and I went on a hike, it's pretty much standard, at least where I live in California. People are like, oh yeah, that's pretty much a normal way to spend a Saturday. So it's become so mainstream and accepted in certain areas. And I know that's not all states, but it's really growing quite rapidly. We're getting so many documentaries. I mean, Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, and then the Netflix documentary shifted, hundreds of millions of people's views on psychedelics and their potential. And now we're seeing those shift even further with psychedelics for veterans and individuals suffering from mental health challenges. So I think we've come a long way, and my family has just been kind of, supportive throughout the journey. And yeah, it's been good.
That's cool. That's nice to hear. What do you what do you think is kind of the next things that you're really interested in exploring with unlimited science? Like, what are the next
So,
projects that you're like, hell yeah, stoked on this? We're gonna
yeah.
uncover the next XYZ.
So I am really interested in essentially doing what we did for our psilocybin project. So we had this huge amount of data, over 8,000 individuals enrolled in this prospective study. And prospective means we collect data at baseline before they take psilocybin and then at several points afterwards. So to do that, you can cross compare and you can see changes in various health outcomes. So I'd love to do that with all psychedelics or psychoactive substances like MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, DMT, ibogaine. So if we could have a mass registry of people, anyone who's going to try a psychedelic, if they can go to this registry, register, sign up, do a baseline before they take it, and then we can track their experience over a 1, 2 year period, give that data back to them so they get that kind of process back where they get their own data. Um, I would love to do that project. We're in fundraising right now, trying to fundraise for that. And so hopefully we'll, fingers crossed, maybe start that project next year. But to have a what we call the general registry of psychedelics, where anyone in the world can sign up and track their progress over time and get real world evidence on how people are using psychedelics, what strains they're using, the dosages they're using, what they're using it for, their intentions, their narrative experiences, like that, I think would shift how we're looking at psychedelics and their and how they're being used by people right now.
That's a big one. Shoot,
Yeah, it's a big
sometimes
project.
sometimes I don't even, who knows how much is in this thing, unless you
Yeah.
got you know the fruit, right? It's like, oh, I can weigh that, but otherwise you're
Yeah, in our
a
last
lot of
study,
people
we
have
had
gummies or chocolate bar, you're like, ah, it says something on the label, but
I
you
mean,
know
that's true. I mean, so many products are mislabeled. We're seeing those issues in cannabis research. But yeah, essentially, with our last day, we actually had pictures. So we had like this is so if you don't have a scale, you don't know how much you're taking. Like this is how much 1 gram of dried mushrooms looks like. This is how much
yeah,
3 grams of dried. So we had people kind of estimate and approximate based on that. So it's not a perfect science in that regard, but real world evidence never is, unfortunately. But it does allow us to, of course, get that mass amount of data and real world evidence that we can't see in clinical trials.
cool, love it. I'm excited for it, and I know we got linked up too around the hotline. Um,
Yes.
which I think is really cool. And again, it's like and you know, I've been the hotline for people, right? Where you get a call and someone's on the other end of the phone, your homie, and they're like, "Oh man, I just talk me through this." And you're like, "Okay, cool," you know.
Yeah.
Which again, I'm kind of like the AI trip sitter. It's like, man, this is perfect, especially if you got it on like the voice, and you're talking to it. Um, what's the vision behind the hotline?
Yeah, so I mean that was exactly our idea behind the hotline. So there are, existing places you can go if you're having an experience and currently tripping and need help while in a challenging experience or just need support. But there really wasn't any hotline available for people who were thinking about having an experience or planning an experience or even integrating their experience. And the problem is there's so much misinformation out there, and you can call a friend and they'll tell you one thing, and you call another friend and they'll tell you another thing. One will say, take this, take that, take this dose, do that dose, do it with lemon tech or do it without. Like, there's a million ways to kind of go about this, and people just get really overwhelmed. There's a lot of people that are wanting to break into that area and have their first psychedelic experience, and they're doing it without a lot of education or being misinformed about certain things. So we wanted to correct for that. So our hotline is so we have trained individuals who are coaches and licensed in psychedelic assisted therapy, and so these individuals can answer questions on anything to do with preparation or integration of the psychedelic experience. So we can give you evidence-based information. So everything we have is based on a really enormous research library of psychedelics, and we take that data from real-world evidence, and that was really the crux of a whole organization. Was this has to be based on real-world evidence. There's a lot of anecdotal information out there, a lot of he said, she said sort of information, but we wanted to be based on hard science. This is what the science says. And so we answer questions for any question on psychedelics based on what the research says. And we're able to translate that kind of difficult academic jargon into more tangible and easily digested forms of information that people can understand. So that's kind of how the info line started, and it's going well now. We have a great team on it who can answer any question. We have really a fantastic group of individuals. So if you do want, if you ever want to speak to someone, you have any question about psychedelics, we get a range of people. We get practitioners and medical doctors or first time users. It's a broad range of people who are looking for answers on psychedelics.
We'll definitely plug the hotline in the show notes for sure.
Oh, awesome.
I love that. I was like, this is, I was like, heck yeah, this is needed,
Yeah.
needed service. Just like, again, right, like a third party that's, unbiased, you know, no qualm one way or the other. Just, hey, here's what you need to know.
Exactly. And it's completely free. And yeah, we do it because we just want to give back to the community in that way. We collect the data that we do and we give it back to the community. We use our own data too from our psilocybin study. So yeah, we're just doing whatever we can to raise education awareness and specifically harm reduction and safety around psychedelic use.
Nice. Anything else that you want to share that I didn't ask?
No, I think that's all. That was great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you opening up and giving a little backstory and sharing some
Yeah.
vulnerability with the audience and the community. And yeah, it's
That was
I'm
definitely
always
the most vulnerable I've been in an interview for sure.
I am honored. I'm always honored. Anybody that wants to come on the platform and share, I'm honored to facilitate. And it's one of those things too where it helps me integrate and pulls me back through the things that I learned and help reinforce you know the muscle memory. And it's always very interesting to kind of see how externalizing helps someone on the other end, and
Yeah.
in the community. It's like a full circle impact when we open up and share some of these
I
things.
mean, I love the impact of someone hearing someone else's story, relating to it, kind of thinking about going through the same thing or exploring
Mhm.
psychedelics in their own way. I mean, that's how we change stigma. That's how we educate and raise awareness to the benefits of psychedelics.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you greatly. We'll cut here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.